Stories of the Dead. Volume 1, Phil Osibin, a novel of remembrance and reckoning. Prologue. The story you are about to read is not fiction in the way most stories are. It has been gathered, stitched together from found journals, broken broadcasts, half-buried memories, and the scarred testimony of those few who dared to survive. These are the words of real people who watched the world unravel and were forever changed by what they witnessed. The event known in whispers as the Fall did not happen overnight. It came slowly, first as rumor, then sickness, then silence. By the time the world understood what was happening, it was already too late. Some called it a virus, others a punishment, and a few, those who listened closest to the old ways, called it a reckoning. This volume follows the path of Phil Osibin, hermit, forager, reluctant witness. What you're about to read are his earliest steps into the long dark. Read them not as fantasy, but as fragments of something true. A record, a warning, a memory. Welcome to the stories of the dead. Chapter 1. The Shaman's Warning, as recorded in the journals that survived the Fall. In the old forests of southwestern Russia, long before the roads crumbled and the cities grew silent, there was a clearing known only to those who still listened to the land. It was a place untouched by satellite or scripture, where smoke curled slowly toward the stars and the trees whispered to one another in the wind. Two men sat by the fire that night. The first was a man worn by time, Phil Osibin, 58 winters to his name, and the weight of twice that in his eyes. He had the look of one who had spent more of his life under the open sky than beneath any roof. His frame was stocky, built for labor and for bearing burdens, and his heavy coat smelled of pine, smoke, and the long miles behind him. His beard was wild and graying, his gaze deep-set and wary, the kind of eyes that have seen too much and trust too little. And yet, when the firelight danced upon his face, there was something gentle buried in the grime and lines, like an old dog who had not forgotten how to love, but had grown cautious of hands. Beside him sat Joe, his younger cousin by blood, though in spirit they were often as different as dawn and dusk. Joe was 33, slender, sharp of cheek and keen of mind. His jacket was clean where Phil's was patched, and his hair still held a boyish lift, and his smile, when it showed, carried the quick wit of a man too clever for his own good. But beneath the jest, there was something tempered, like steel that had been through the forge. Joe had seen things too, and though he laughed, it was the laughter of someone who knew the cost of silence. They sipped from rough clay cups, filled with a dark tea brewed from the spotted red caps of forest mushrooms, Amanita muscaria, known to some as poison, to others as sacrament. Across the fire sat the shaman, his name lost to time, or perhaps never spoken aloud. His coat was of furs and fibers, woven from seasons long gone, and his eyes glimmered like wet stone. When he spoke, his words moved slowly, not with hesitation but with gravity, as if each syllable were being drawn from a well beneath the world. Life, he said, stirring the embers with a crooked stick, is not a line, but a wheel. It turns, and in turning, it remembers. Phil blinked slowly, the word pressing into his thoughts like a boot into soft earth. Man has forgotten this. He builds as if the wheel has stopped turning, but the forest has not forgotten, nor has the sky. A soft wind rustled through the trees then, as if the forest had nodded in agreement. Beside them, a small radio sputtered to life, crackling with the panic of a world not yet ready to reckon with itself. Widespread failures, infected exhibiting violent behavior. Stay indoors. Repeat, stay indoors. Without a word, the shaman reached out and clicked the device off. "Don't let their fear cloud your clarity," he said, as if swatting away a fly. "They speak of sickness, but it is not the body that is ailing. It is the soul." Phil looked across the fire at Joe, who offered a small shrug as if to say, "He's not wrong." Then the shaman smiled, not kindly, but with the solemnity of a priest announcing a funeral. "Soon," he whispered, eyes glinting, "we celebrate the reckoning." And the fire crackled on. Chapter 2. Outsiders at the Festival. The celebration was not marked by banners or programs. No vendors, no security lines, just drums, fires, and the rhythm of feet stomping the sacred soil. The gathering had no name, at least not one that could be translated easily into English. It was something older, a rite and passed mouth to mouth, leaf to leaf, across generations that no longer remembered why they danced, only that it mattered. By the time the outsiders arrived, the clearing was already pulsing with a kind of ancient joy, the kind that doesn't come from merriment, but from knowing, deep in the bones, that one stands at the edge of something great and terrible. They came in a dented hatchback that wheezed like an asthmatic bear, its muffler dragging like a severed limb. 4 of them, young, loud, American. They parked, crooked beneath a leaning pine, and stepped out like tourists stumbling into a cathedral. Their names are lost, or perhaps never mattered, but for the sake of the record, let them be known by the impressions they left behind. The first, tall and sunburned, led the group like a man used to being listened to. He wore mirrored sunglasses despite the dusk, and carried himself with a swagger that hadn't yet been tested by consequence. He laughed too loud, too easily, especially when it was at someone else's expense. The second was quiet but watchful, always glancing from face to face, as though seeking cues on how to behave. He laughed at all the ringleaders' jokes, even the cruel ones, especially the cruel ones. Sweat gleamed at his brow, but he wiped it away discreetly, hoping no one would notice the tremble in his hand. The third, whose frame was thinner and frailer, looked ill the moment they stepped from the car. His shoulders sagged, eyes sunken, skin pale beneath a sheen of perspiration. He coughed, wet, heavy, and the others turned from him, annoyance flashing in their eyes. The loud one slapped him on the back. "Jesus, man, again with this," he said. "Go lie down before you infect us with your vibes." There was no sympathy in the gesture, only inconvenience. The sick one was ushered to a tent with too much speed. The blind follower zipped it shut behind him, then shared a chuckle with the ringleader. "Dude's always crying wolf," he said. "He'll be fine after a nap." No one replied. No one asked if he needed anything. The fourth lingered near the rear of the car, staring up at the sky with wide eyes. His name was Seth, or so one of them muttered. He had taken something earlier, and it had begun to take him back. Acid, perhaps, or something more obscure. Whatever it was, it had unraveled his tether to the moment. He stood silently, mouth slightly open, eyes fixed on the tree line where the last light of the sun bled through the pines like spilled wine. One of the group called out with a half-laugh, "Hey, Seth, you good, man?" No answer, just a slow blink. They laughed, not kindly, but because discomfort is easier when it's dressed as amusement. And then they turned and made their way toward the beating heart of the gathering, drums thudding like war or worship. Seth followed behind them slowly, as though being drawn by something he didn't understand. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know what they'd brought with them. But the forest did. Chapter 3. Encounter at the Festival. By the time night had settled like a woolen blanket over the treetops, the festival had transformed. The air pulsed with the heartbeat of drums, deep ancestral rhythms echoing through bodies like memory. Fires flickered high, casting long shadows across dancers whose faces were painted, not with pigment, but with purpose. Some chanted, others sang in voices foreign yet familiar, as though each note had been born before language. Phil and Joe stood on the edge of the firelight, the smoke curling in their beards and clothes, their minds warmed by both the tea and the flame. They weren't strangers here, but neither were they initiates. They were listeners, watchers, two men caught in the strange gravity of something old, something sacred. Phil leaned on a walking stick he hadn't needed that morning, his joints creaking more than usual. Joe, as always, stood with a lazy lean, his smile playing at the corners of his mouth, arms crossed like a man who'd seen too many parties to be easily impressed. That's when they noticed the three outsiders. Phil spotted them first. The light of the fire didn't touch them the way it touched the others. They stood too straight, laughed too loud. They carried with them the scent of aluminum and asphalt, a world that no longer belonged here. The ringleader was barking something at the others, holding a tin flask and swinging it like a totem of dominance. The blind follower clung to every word, nodding and laughing with such frequency it seemed like a compulsion. His eyes were glassy now, and his brow slick with a nervous sheen. He wiped it away, again, subtly. Seth stood behind them, half in shadow, rocking ever so slightly. His pupils were moons, his fingers twitching like leaves in wind. He was not in the same place as the others, perhaps not even in the same time. Phil elbowed Joe lightly. "Americans." Joe smirked. "You can smell 'em." "Loud one's the pack leader," Phil muttered. Joe nodded. "And the sweaty one's his echo." Phil grunted while scratching his beard. His eyes lingered on Seth. "That one's drowning in his own head." Joe chuckled. "Reminds me of you your first time on the tee." "I didn't look that lost," Phil grumbled, though they both knew he had. As the drumming intensified, Phil stepped forward, offering the most natural excuse he could think of. "Hey," he said to the group, "your friend looks like he could use some grounding. I'm headed back toward camp. I'll walk him there." The ringleader gave a lazy shrug, eyes not even meeting Phil's. "Whatever, dude. He ain't my responsibility." The follower gave a half-hearted, "Yeah, sure," before turning back to the fire, already forgetting the man they came with. Phil turned to Seth. The young man blinked at him, as if trying to remember how faces worked. "Come on," Phil said gently. "Let's get you someplace quiet." Seth followed without protest. Perhaps he thought Phil was part of the vision. Joe gave a little salute as they walked past. "See you later, cuz." Phil raised a hand in reply, leading the dazed outsider through the tapestry of tents and trees, away from the chaos of the fire, and toward the deeper quiet, where the real world still lingered. Chapter 4. Fireside Foreshadowing. The fire had grown small, but it still lived, glowing in its cradle of stones like a relic from an older age. It gave off just enough heat to push back the night, though only by a few feet in each direction. Beyond that thin ring of warmth, the woods waited in hush, wrapped in shadow and frost. Phil sat with his legs stretched out and his back against a crooked stump. His coat was pulled tight around him, patched and stained, but loyal. The tin of beans at the fire's edge bubbled quietly, the smell mixing with pine sap, and the faint smoke curling up into the darkened boughs. The drums were far off now, but still present, deep and low, like a memory humming in his chest. Occasionally, he caught the tail end of a chant or a sharp burst of laughter from the festival's heart, echoing down through the trees. It felt like a different world already, a strange and beautiful fever dream, fading as the real night took hold. He had left Seth in the tent not long ago. The boy had drifted off within minutes, mumbling something about wings and the forest breathing. He'd gone under fast, like a leaf slipping beneath a stream. Phil hadn't bothered trying to decipher the visions. He just made sure the kid was warm, zipped the flap, and walked back to camp with the soft dread that always follows a man who's seen too much too fast. He didn't know the kid's friends, didn't know where they'd wandered off to, and truth be told, he didn't care. Phil poked at the fire with a stick, rolling over a charred log and sending up a small fountain of sparks. His bones ached in the kind of way that had nothing to do with weather. He was tired in the soul, not the kind of tired a man sleeps off. He stirred the beans slowly, watching them turn over and over in the pot like thoughts that refused to settle. The hermit's path leads not to survival, the shaman had said hours earlier beneath that strange twilight sky, but to transcendence. Phil hadn't known what to make of it at the time, still didn't, but the words sat in him like a stone in a river, cold, unmoving, undeniable. Maybe they're onto something, he muttered, voice low, barely more than a breath. The trees swayed gently overhead, their limbs creaking like old rafters. He listened without listening, the way a woodsman does, alert to patterns, not details. The wind shifted slightly. It brought with it no cry, no roar, no omen, just cold, the kind of cold that pressed into the skin like the fingers of something watching, waiting. Phil pulled his coat tighter, settled his spoon into the pot, and let his eyes wander toward the tree line. All seemed still, all was still, and somewhere down a crooked trail, behind a tent no one was watching, something ceased to be a man. But Phil didn't know that. He just sat there, thinking about the fire and the silence and the way the world seemed to be holding its breath. Chapter 5. Screams in the Dark. The fire hissed as a knot in the wood burst, sending a crackling pop into the night. Phil blinked slowly, the warmth on his face beginning to falter, the cold creeping steadily in beneath his coat. He hadn't added more wood. He hadn't moved in minutes. He simply sat there, lost in the soft rhythm of silence. He thought of Joe, probably still back at the main grounds, dancing or drinking, or debating the meaning of it all with a woman in feathers and beads. Joe had a way of slipping into people's stories, always smiling, always nodding like he understood more than he let on. Phil allowed himself a small, crooked grin at the thought, then stirred the beans one last time, scooped a bite, and leaned back again. The wind shifted, a distant thump. No, more than that. A rumble, low at first, like footsteps on packed soil. Then a shout, faint, carried on the air like a leaf tumbling through branches. Phil straightened slightly. His ears had grown keen in these woods. He knew the difference between celebration and chaos. This wasn't music. This wasn't ritual. This was panic. Another shout, clearer now, then screaming. Not the playful shrieks of revelers gone wild. This was sharp, desperate, terrified. Phil rose slowly to his feet, every joint complaining. He set down the spoon, stepped away from the fire, and peered into the darkness between the trees. He could see nothing, only hear it. The sound was growing. Shouts, heavy footfalls, crashing brush. Then, "Phil, run!" It was Joe's voice. No mistaking it. Raw and frantic, ripped from his throat like it had been torn out of him by force. Phil staggered forward a step. "Joe?" Branches snapped to the left. And then there he was. Joe came barreling through the tree line, eyes wide with fear, coat torn, hands flailing for balance. Behind him, shadows, many of them, moving fast, moving wrong. Phil's mind reeled, trying to place what he was seeing. People, animals, no, something else. "What the fuck did you do, cuz?" Phil shouted, instinctively reaching for the hatchet on his belt, but not yet raising it. Joe didn't answer. He just kept running, toward the camp, toward the fire, toward Phil. But as he passed the path leading to the second tent, the one no one had checked on, the flap exploded outward. A figure lunged from the shadows with inhuman speed, slamming into Joe's side and sending him sprawling. Phil caught a glimpse. A face contorted in death, jaw unhinged, eyes clouded, skin gray-blue and tight like dried leather. The sick one, the one they had abandoned, no longer human. Joe hit the ground hard, rolled and kicked violently as the creature shrieked and clawed. "Run!" He bellowed again, not to escape, but to save Phil. Phil's legs moved before his mind did. He grabbed his pack, turned from the fire, and bolted into the trees. The weight of decision was gone, replaced by sheer animal instinct. Branches whipped his face, roots clawed at his boots. The wind howled behind him, but he didn't look back. Somewhere in the chaos, Joe's voice was lost, gone. Phil ran until his lungs burned, until his knees buckled beneath him. He crawled into a gully and lay there, chest heaving, eyes wide with the wild horror of what he'd seen. He didn't know what had become of Joe, didn't know if Seth was still alive in that tent. But he knew one thing with a certainty that settled into his bones like frost. The reckoning had begun. Chapter 6. The Hermit Emerges. 3 weeks later. The forest was thick with silence. Not the gentle kind that comes after snowfall or the peace of early morning, but the oppressive kind, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that might never come. Phil moved through the underbrush like a shadow, worn and hollowed by the days that had passed, 3 weeks by his reckoning, though time had begun to feel like a story someone else was telling. His beard had grown coarse and matted, his clothes stiff with dirt and sweat. The checkered flannel he wore beneath his coat was torn at the sleeve, revealing skin pale from lack of sun and marred by scrapes. His eyes, once sharp and skeptical, had dulled to something deeper, a gaze that saw not just what was, but what had been. He had not spoken aloud in days, not since the screams, not since the woods swallowed the last of the drums. He had lived off roots, mushrooms, and rainwater, taking only what he needed and leaving no sign of his passing. The trail he walked now wasn't a trail at all, just a path of least resistance through ferns and broken branches. The animals had gone quiet. Even the birds, save for the crows, seemed to have vanished. And then he heard it. Not a scream, not a growl. Laughter, faint, distant, but unmistakable, human. Phil froze. The sound rang like a bell in a tomb, alien, almost offensive after so much emptiness. He crouched low, brushed aside a curtain of pine boughs, and peered out from the trees. There it was, a town, or what passed for one now. A tall palisade wall rose from the earth like an ancient fort, constructed of timber and scavenged metal. Smoke curled from a chimney at its heart. A figure walked along the wall with a rifle slung over his shoulder. Somewhere within, a child's voice called out, and was answered with soft laughter. Phil's breath caught in his throat. He stepped forward. Not far, just enough for his boots to touch the clearing's edge. His hands trembled, not from fear, not entirely. He dropped the basket he'd been carrying, mushrooms spilling across the moss like lost coins. His knees went weak. For the first time in weeks, he saw the shape of civilization, not the old one, twisted by convenience and illusion, but something raw and human, built from ruin. His eyes welled, his lips parted, yet he did not speak. He just stood there, staring. The wind stopped, abruptly for a moment, but then the birds began to sing, as a soft breeze dried the tear growing in Phil's eye.